I want to say before I go on that I have never previously told anyone my sordid past in detail. I haven't done it now to sound as though I might be proud of how bad, how evil I was. But people are always speculating, why am I as I am? To understand that of any person, his whole life, from birth, must be reviewed. The full story is the best way that I know to have it seen and understood that I had sunk to the very bottom of the American white man's society when, soon now in prison, I found Allah and the religion of Islam, and it completely transformed my life.
Ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho-ho.
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And we are going to be talking today about the Autobiography of Malcolm X, as told to Alex Haley. It's a very warm summer day today, and people outside are doing their lawns and making a bunch of noise. Hopefully that won't be too audible or too disruptive for the podcast. But nevertheless, we're going to carry on.
And also, we hate leaf blowers.
Yeah. Why would you even? I don't know. This is an interesting addition to our loose trilogy of books about America.
Or books that say something about America, that say something that belongs in the conversation and belongs in the conversation in a way that I think interacts in all kinds of interesting ways with conversations that are happening right now. I mean, it's a book from the mid-'60s, right? But I kept thinking about contemporary conversations as I was reading it.
Yeah, and it also makes a really interesting contrast to the last book that we talked about, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, which has a very different view of America, but also one that's relevant to today's conversations.
Yeah, exuberantly positive, exuberantly optimistic in the case of Whitman, a lot less sanguine.
A lot less. Yeah, and a lot more based in the kinds of cold historical facts that we found wanting sometimes in Whitman.
Yeah, that's brutally true. I mean, one of the most, getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but one of the passages that I found really moving rereading for today was Malcolm X talking about reading history and being shocked by the kinds of things he was finding that he hadn't encountered in the schools. So the historical sense is really acute here.
Yeah, and very important for him and for his arguments and his politics. But it's not just the books about America that this text can connect to. You know, we've talked about another curiously written autobiography in the past.
Yeah, autobiography is one of these genres that kind of claims for itself like a singular point of origin, like it's the story of a particular person. But the one that we talked about together, the Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, was by Gertrude Stein, and we talked about the complicated ways in which the subject, right, the self is constructed there. And here too, we've got a kind of a complicated writing arrangement. Which
is also very interesting historically because a lot of early African-American narratives are told by people in autobiographical form and very much underlining the fact that they are writing it themselves. The autobiography of Frederick Douglass and several of the other early narratives are all very much as written by him or herself. And yet this is taking a very different tack by having it be written by someone else and having that be so prominent on the cover.
That's a really interesting point. I think for those early narratives that you're talking about, those 19th century narratives, part of the insistence on authorship is really about, how can I put it, the autobiography being also a witnessing document. And one of the things it's witnessing to is its author's literacy, their ability to speak for themselves, right? To have a platform to speak from. And here in the Autobiography of Malcolm X, it's truly a kind of a collaboration that's happening between him and another African-American writer. So it's a slightly different, in some ways there's a continuity with that 19th century tradition, but in some ways it's doing something quite different.
It'll be interesting to explore how that plays out. Alex Haley, a very different person from Malcolm X and coming with a very different set of politics.
Which he's open about. One of the things that I really like about this book is that there's this long epilogue by Alex Haley, almost giving you another version of the same story, but from his point of view and being really clear about what that context looks like from his point of view.
From a process perspective, this is all very interesting.
Yeah, because the original sort of the ways in which the autobiography came to be written was because Alex Haley had done an interview with Malcolm X for Playboy magazine in 1963, I think, and they established a certain level of trust. One of the things Haley writes about in his epilogue is how Malcolm had been very distrustful and said, well, you know, the white man is never going to let you print that. And in fact, Haley got some of those comments through. And that created a certain level of trust in Haley's account. And then they came together to work on the autobiography. And it was also a little bit of a rocky road getting to, again, a level of trust and a level of openness that could produce this kind of collaborative autobiography.
Yeah, because originally Malcolm was very interested in having this be his political philosophy and a series of essays and lectures about his politics and the state of the black man and the white man, so to speak, in America. And Haley was interested in a much more personal story. He saw this very compelling and fascinating man who's had a life that a lot of his readers, which were primarily white readers, didn't have access to otherwise. And he thought that it could be quite compelling and quite profitable.
Yeah, this desire on the part of Malcolm X to keep himself in the background, something that was super important to him when he was a minister in the Nation of Islam, which was part of his sort of ministerial mission, right? Was to keep himself as much as possible subordinated to the vision of Elijah Muhammad, right? So you see that kind of shifting over time in the course of the autobiography.
Well, maybe we should give a little bit of an overview of his life, which I guess will also serve as a bit of a plot summary for this. So he was born in Michigan, I believe.
Well, I think he's born actually in Nebraska, but then brought up from early childhood in Michigan around Lansing.
Right. And he has a very rough early life. His father, who is also very outspoken, is killed when he's quite young. And he grows up believing fully that he will also die violently and suddenly at a young age.
And also, it's not just the awful murder of his father that's part of what shapes that early experience. It's also a mother he describes trying hard to keep a family together under almost impossible circumstances. And so it's clear he's got this really powerful relationship with his siblings. And those siblings are interwoven throughout the narrative in all kinds of really compelling ways.
Yeah, they appear and disappear and reappear in really striking ways over the course of especially the first half. But yeah.
Well, even later on, too, his older sister Ella plays an incredibly important role in his life, even later on in a really powerful way.
Yeah, she sounds like an amazing person. Very, very strong-willed woman who gets her way and someone who Malcolm tries to convert. And it takes, I believe, 5 years for her to finally be convinced of what he's trying to put down.
Yeah. And more than that, later on, once he himself has become alienated from the Nation of Islam and he's interested in going on Hajj, she's the one that he turns to because she's already become an Orthodox Muslim and she's been, doing Arabic classes in her home at this point. So Malcolm comes off in this book as a leader and a teacher, which he absolutely is. But there are these curious moments where, uniquely, I think, with that older sister of his, he's got a follower relationship. And that's I found fascinating thing to notice in a book that in other places is quite misogynistic, right?
Yes.
I mean, to our eyes anyways, right?
Yeah.
But the relationship with Ella is slightly different.
Yeah. And just in case any listeners don't know, the Hajj is the religious pilgrimage to Mecca that all Muslims are required to take at some point in their lives, if they're able to. And he's able to go on the Hajj because she had been saving up money for herself to be able to go on the Hajj, and just gives the money to Malcolm thinking this will be a more important thing and that she'll be able to save up more money and go on her own Hajj later, I suppose.
And she's someone who's transformed his life more than once. We were going to give a little overview of the life trajectory. She's also the person who got him out of Michigan and brought him to Boston, brought him into a wider world. He has that tough upbringing that you were referring to with early life in his family back in Michigan. His older sister brings him to Boston, where he kind of finds his way in the world. And then he finds his way to New York, to Harlem. And one of the things that struck me so powerfully about this early phase of his life is that he's so young.
Yeah.
He's like a young teenager, 16, 17, by the time we're down in Harlem.
Yeah, he gets to Boston, I guess he's about 14, and he is living a very active life. He is spending time at the getting jobs at the dance hall. He is interacting with all sorts of people, and people are always mistaking him for being much older than he is. And when you're reading it, it's very easy to similarly think, oh, he must be about 18 by now. But no, he's 14.
Yeah.
He's a very tall 14-year-old, but he's 14.
And it's with a sense of shock that you hear that when you get these little interruptions where you're like, oh, wow, that's amazing. And so, the overall structure of the narrative is one that, follows this path that moves sort of geographically from Michigan to Boston, down to New York, and then back up to Boston briefly before the first catastrophe of the narrative, where he's gotten involved in the drug trade, he's gotten involved in planned burglaries, and eventually ends up in jail. And that's a sort of dramatic turn in the narrative. And then things happen. His life changes while he's in jail in ways that we're going to talk about. And then there's another kind of geographical narrative where he goes back to where he started out, back in Michigan with his family, now in Detroit, as opposed to in Lansing, and sort of reestablishes himself in a second phase of his life, a really different phase of his life. And that goes from Detroit down to Chicago again, and then more widely around the U.S. as he takes on this ministerial mission. And then there's another catastrophe, another kind of fall or a turn in the narrative. And that's going to involve him going to other parts of the world, going on Hajj to Mecca, traveling throughout the Middle East, and then in parts of Africa as well. So it's a book that in some ways simply follows the trajectory of one person's life, but it's also shaped, I think, in a very, very literary kind of way. And there you see those two authors, right?
Yeah. And we, as you say, we see him in various physical locations in various places, but we also see him taking on different names.
Mm-hmm.
He grows up with his birth name, and then he is given all sorts of different nicknames along the way. He's called Red, and then Detroit Red, and then when he arrives in jail, he's known as Satan because he's just so wild and sacrilegious. And then he has his conversion, and then eventually he takes a new name, Malcolm X.
Takes a new name. That's a really important distinction, right? Because there are these name changes that happen, right? And some of the names are given to him. Like there's the name he gets as an infant, right? Malcolm, right? And then there's the nickname that people call him, Hey Red, right? Because he's got this reddish hair. But the X, it's not that he chooses the X, it's given to him. And this is really important for him. He says, during this time I received from Chicago, which is the headquarters of the Nation of Islam, I received from Chicago my X. The Muslim's X symbolized the true African family name that he could never know. For me, my X replaced the white slave master name of Little, which some blue-eyed devil named Little had imposed upon my paternal forebears. The receipt of my X meant that forever after in the Nation of Islam I would be known as Malcolm X. Mr. Muhammad taught that we would keep this X until God himself returned and gave us a holy name from his own mouth. And I feel like that's a really powerful passage because there's an awful lot happening there. It's saying something about names and the things they name, who you are. Your name says something about who you are. And he receives this name. It's not the same as the nickname, but it's coming from outside. Whereas when he comes back from Hajj, he's like, we see a letter that he's written that he signs with his new name. Al-Hajj al-Malik al-Shabazz, right? Which is saying something about himself, naming himself in a name he gives himself or receives in a different kind of way.
That was very interesting, the end of the passage you just read, the fact that he will keep that name until he gets a new name from God. And it is when he is on his pilgrimage to Mecca and he's at the Hajj that he receives his new name.
Yeah.
I hadn't noticed that because when he receives a new name, as you say, he just signs it.
It's just there.
It's just there.
Mm-hmm.
He does later explain a bit about how he got the name.
Because Al-Hajj just means someone who's gone on Hajj, right? So it's the act that makes the name in some sense. So naming is doing this really interesting kind of work. And I'm kind of torn, right? Because on the one hand, I see that as a kind of a literary device that weaves through the whole narrative. I'm like, oh, that's got to be Alex Haley doing that. But on the other hand, this naming is clearly coming from Malcolm X himself, right?
Oh, yeah. I think Haley just used his journalistic as well as novelistic abilities to just recognize that this is a good thread that he could tie this together with, that it made perfect sense to think about this constant changing of names and this constant changing of locations to go along with the constant changing of person, the constant conversions that are happening again and again as Malcolm's world and his personality take dramatic turns.
That's interesting in terms of how naming works, but it's also interesting in terms of how identity works and how his changes take place over time. When he's traveling throughout different parts of Africa, he spent some time in Nigeria and he's given the Yoruba name Omowale, the son who has come home. And that's part of his sort of African nationalist experience, which doesn't contradict his experience as a Muslim going on Hajj and traveling throughout the Middle East and North Africa. But it's another layer to his experience and his identity and who he is and what he wants to do in the world, which is, thinking again about this as an autobiography and the ways in which it strikes you as a reader, so poignant. I always think every time I read those parts of the book, I'm always thinking, well, you always think what would have come next? Where's he going to go? What's he going to do? What's possible? But you also know what happened.
Yes.
Right? It's like unbearable, I think.
Which is, in case anybody doesn't know what happened, he gets assassinated after he has come back from his travels and has a new outlook on the world and is giving lectures, sometimes contradicting Nation of Islam beliefs.
Well, he has no shortage of enemies, right? I mean, that's something that's a little obscure even now, right? The extent to which his alienation from the leadership of the Nation of Islam directly brought about his assassination and the extent to which he has other political enemies, right? So I think even now that's a little bit murky exactly who's behind it, but he has no shortage of enemies, right? And so in February 1965, he's assassinated. And Haley writes about this in the epilogue. It gives a really good account of it, both in terms of what happened and also the impact on people and the ways he was mourned and the ways in which very different kinds of people in the African American community, but also beyond, responded to what had happened.
Including a sort of post-epilogue
Yeah.
By one of the people in the Black community who spoke at his funeral.
Ossie Davis, isn't it?
Ossie Davis, yeah.
It's beautiful.
It's a lovely piece, and another voice in the set of voices that are contributing to this autobiography.
Yeah.
But it's founded on the question of why did you speak at the funeral? Like, this is somebody who is not necessarily an obvious follower of Malcolm.
No. And it's elegiac, right? And on the one hand, I'm a big sucker for elegy, right? I find it moving. It's really powerful. But every time I go back and I read the autobiography, I get so angry.
Yeah.
And the sense of loss and the sorrow and the elegy, like that's all really important. But it's also important to be thinking about what was the message there? What was being said there? What was he trying to do? What are the conversations that are unfinished that were going on in 1965 that are not done, that are far from being done? Right. So thinking about the ways in which that conversation still hasn't come to an end, I feel like there's an awful lot that book has to say right now that doesn't come out of the elegiac, that doesn't come out of the framing. It comes out of the anger.
I think we should also take a moment to describe to listeners who are not as familiar with it a little bit about the Nation of Islam.
Yeah. So I don't want to go too far down the sort of historical path in talking about the Nation of Islam in America. It is really important to know that there have been Muslim Black Americans since the 17th century. So there's a very long tradition of Islam in North America. And the Nation of Islam is a particular, some people see it as not really part of the Islamic community because they have a very idiosyncratic theology. Others do see Black Muslims as part of that. But there's a kind of an early, almost sort of mystical foundation through the figure of wtih, who was someone who apparently had Middle Eastern heritage, who formed a kind of a basis in the African American community, worked closely with Elijah Muhammad, and established the Nation of Islam, which is in some ways has a lot of continuity with Islam understood more broadly with its various sectarian divisions, Sunni, Shia, and others. But also has quite an idiosyncratic theology, almost you could say a kind of a mythology, some would say, that underlies it, that has to do with the creation of humanity and the role of race differences, which it understands in a really essential way. So it's a kind of a political philosophy and a religious orientation that has a really rich history in the United States.
And Malcolm gets converted to this through
his brother. And the rest of his family, but particularly his brother.
While he's in prison.
Mm-hmm.
And after he is out of prison, he meets up with Elijah Muhammad and becomes one of the most powerful acolytes, preachers, people spreading the word, proselytizers of the religion, and really takes a leadership role in organizing new temples, new mosques in different communities and building up church membership from a few hundred to tens of thousands.
Yeah. Clearly he's ambitious. He's effective. And of course this causes problems, right? Like it's good to be good at your job, but sometimes it's a problem if you're a little too good.
Yes.
And it's clear that one of the things that happens is even though Malcolm talks about trying to be self-effacing and not put himself in front, and to always be putting Elijah Muhammad in front. And when you look at interviews from the period, he's clearly doing that. Nonetheless, he's a charismatic guy. He's committed. He's effective. And that causes problems.
Yeah, and he is the public face of the Nation of Islam, partially because Elijah Muhammad gets sickly and can't make as many public appearances, but also because Malcolm's really good at it.
He's incredibly good at it. One of the motifs that runs through the book, or little themes that comes back a number of times, and I don't think this is coming from Alex Haley. I think this is coming from things that Malcolm is saying because it comes up in his own voice over and over again. This question of being a lawyer, right? There's this little reminiscence of a formative experience when he was in grade school talking with a teacher who was ordinarily seemed like a pretty nice guy, pretty supportive. He's talking to Malcolm about, well, what might you want to do when you finish up school? And Malcolm's like, well, maybe I might like to be a lawyer. And the teacher's like, oh, don't be ridiculous. right? Oh, you're good with your hands. Maybe you could be a carpenter or something. And this clearly has some impact on him. And then there are these other moments later on in the narrative that come up where Malcolm is clearly taking pride in his ability to box his opponent into a corner, right? To sort of use his words to overpower his opponent. And then much later on at the end of the chapter that's called Icarus, right? Because of a metaphor that Malcolm uses near the end, he talks about being invited to speak to the Harvard Law Review Forum, right? So there are all these moments where that oratorical ability, that argumentative quality, that ability to argue your way through a case and make things happen and overpower somebody with your words, this is clearly a thing for him. And that's why he becomes kind of dangerous, right, within the Nation of Islam, to some people's mind.
And then later, when allegations come out against Elijah Muhammad that he has been sleeping with several of the secretaries,
fathered several children,
it becomes a real breaking point. At first, Malcolm doesn't believe it, and then eventually he is swayed that this is the truth. And then how do you deal with it? And he starts preparing a defense for Elijah. But then, according to Malcolm, the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad find an excuse to silence him.
Yeah. Moving away for a second from the history that's here and the person that's here to the story that we're being told. One of the things that's, really important to keep in mind is, we're hearing Malcolm's account, right? Mediated through this conversation with Alex Haley, right? We could talk a little bit more about how that conversation gets enacted a little bit later on. But we're also seeing this really complicated situation that's changing and unfolding on the ground. Like they're working on the autobiography together right in the months when the shit is hitting the fan, right? When everything is falling apart. And one of the things that comes out in Alex Haley's epilogue is he talks about his fear and his worry that Malcolm is going to want to rewrite the whole narrative to just write out the Nation of Islam, or to sort of, strike out all those positive things he had been saying and that those parts of his experience. And then they come to an agreement not to do that. But it's really interesting that there's this weird kind of tension in the telling of the story itself. And one of the reasons it's so incredibly powerful, and I think you and I both responded to it in this way, is that on the one hand, we kind of know where the story is going, but on the other hand, we really inhabit the moment, like whether we're in a dance hall in Boston or whether we're involved in, pushing drugs and hearing Billie Holiday in Harlem, or whether we're, copying out the dictionary in prison or preaching to a crowd about how awful the history of the legacy of slavery is. We're inhabiting those moments in a really, really vivid way. And so that's such a strange quality to this book, that we're like in the linear time, we're in the moment, and also we're looking back and we know exactly what's happening. One beautiful example of that happens when Malcolm is talking about his experiences with Elijah Muhammad. And you do get a sense of how much he respected him as a teacher, how much he looked up to him, how much he valued his guidance. Remember, Elijah Muhammad had written letters to him in prison, and he wrote back to him. So they have a kind of relationship that begins well before they meet in person. So there's one moment where Malcolm uses this really neat metaphor that he gets from Elijah Muhammad. He says, "One day, I remember a dirty glass of water was on a counter, and Mr. Muhammad put a clean glass of water beside it. 'You want to know how to spread my teachings?' he said, and he pointed to the glasses of water. 'Don't condemn if you see a person has a dirty glass of water,' he said. 'Just show them the clean glass of water that you have. When they inspect it, you won't have to say that yours is better.' Of all the things that Mr. Muhammad ever was to teach me, I don't know why, that still stands out in my mind. Although I haven't always practiced it, I love too much to battle. I'm inclined to tell somebody if his glass of water is dirty." And right there you get like so much, right? You get that moment of learning and that moment of respect for Elijah Muhammad, and also this irrepressible, I can't help myself from telling somebody their glass of water is dirty. You get so many different moments in that one vivid image.
So you mentioned that as we're reading the book, we know how it ends. And this is my first time reading the book.
Oh, yeah.
And it was phenomenal. And I knew how it ended in the sense that I knew he was assassinated. But in fact, I didn't really know how it ended, because my image of Malcolm X is the image of the angry man pre-Hajj.
Yeah.
And I didn't really know about the, seems a little unfair to say, softening of his message after the Hajj. But
I would say widening.
Yeah.
Like he's in a wider conversation. He's in a wider world that's about, the Islamic world. It's about Pan-African nationalism. It's just the whole world. In the same way that his world became bigger once he left Lansing and came to Boston and New York, also his world becomes way bigger once he goes on Hajj.
Absolutely. But it also made me think about some of the literary questions of autobiography. Because, of course, as I'm starting to read this book, I am coming to this book for that image of that person I have, for the angry preacher, for the angriest black man in America type person who's so compelling, who I've seen footage of, whose story I know a little tiny bit about, and who I want to know more about. And of course, as he says, to understand a person, his whole life from birth must be reviewed. And like many autobiographies, you have to start out with, who is this person before he becomes that person, which is especially dramatic in a case like Malcolm's because he changes many, many times over the course of his life. So in a sense, what do you do with those opening chapters about youth and childhood when you aren't yet showing the compelling picture of the angry young man? And I think they do a really interesting choice here. I mean, you have options. We saw in the Autobiography of L.S.P. Toklas that if you are interested in talking about the interesting adults and not as much about the interesting children, you can just skip over it or bury it in the middle of the book in a quick passage. Here, they don't do that. Here, they do a very chronological order. But the passages before his prison conversion are fascinating in that they really go for this both novelistic at times, but also very sociological study of what the environment was that Malcolm grew up in that led to him becoming the person he was. And it's really tremendous. And it's clearly written for two audiences, for an audience of white readers or other people who are not familiar with what life is like in these mostly black.
Yeah, it explains to you things that would be self-evident to other parts of the community, right?
Right. Yeah. So either you look at it and you recognize what's going on and it's reminding you and you're reveling in the telling of a story that doesn't often get told that you experienced, or you're learning about a society that you may not have really had a good, strong sense of how people navigate. I believe it would be very compelling from both ways. Obviously, I only know it from the outsider perspective.
Yeah, I'm like nodding as you're talking because I'm so interested in thinking about this question of what his life was like, how he recounted his life in this collaboration with Alex Haley, what the goals were, what was on the horizon, and the way he's remembered. And even as you were suggesting earlier, the ways in which he was remembered almost immediately, at his funeral, in people who were commemorating him, people who were, I think, even then trying to domesticate his message as it changed over time, right? You talked about Ossie Davis, right? I have a lot of respect for him, but he was also somebody whose political goals and means to those goals were very different from Malcolm X's, right? So you got to wonder, whose Malcolm is it? To what extent are people trying to domesticate the positions he was taking, the various positions he was taking at different moments? He was clearly his own person. One of the things that comes out real powerfully in this narrative is this thirst to grow and to learn. I mean, he talks about this really movingly in the prison chapters, but also toward the end of the narrative. And again, I think that's Alex Haley really foregrounding that for us, that potentiality.
Yeah. I think Haley in particular was aware of ways that you might try to tell this story to white audiences and what the potential benefits of doing that are. He had written a lot of journalism pieces that were outreaching, so to speak, to white audiences. And he makes a lot of interesting strategic moves in it to try to get both readerships invested in the story, including, again, another voice in the book, the introduction, which is by M.S. Handler, who Malcolm mentions over the course of the autobiography as one of the white men he trusts and respects. And there's just a really weird moment in that introduction where Handler says, talking about Malcolm, his views about the white man were devastating, but at no time did he transgress against my own personality and make me feel that I, as an individual, shared in the guilt.
Oh, that's super icky.
It is.
Yeah.
And it seems throughout the book, even in his most anti-white devil sections, Malcolm does try to thread that needle carefully and saying that maybe he's met a few white people who are not the worst, but that he is talking about...
It's a low bar.
It's a low bar,
Yeah.
but that he's also talking about the white man collectively.
Yeah.
He uses that phrasing a lot, that this is a thing that white people maybe need to understand about their own history and where they've come from childhood onwards, where their history has led to them to be in the place where they are / we are now.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we are, right? This is the thing. This is a bunch of things to say in response to what you're talking about. One is this question of our own situatedness, right? We're reading this as white people. And when I read it, when I first read it, I had recently become a Muslim, right? So I was really fascinated by the latter parts of the story, the parts that you said were less familiar to you, from the popular reception of Malcolm X. So I always find myself thinking a lot about those parts in a particular kind of way, and also thinking about the parts where he talks about women, not just in terms of misogyny, but just being attentive to what is going on there. So I think, like anybody, right, this question of we affectively connect where we feel like we have a point of connection, right? And I think we should talk more about that. But the other thing I wanted to comment more on is the opening white readers' eager desire to find a way to make this narrative work for them, right? And you see that in the introduction. You see it too in this little piece that I read not too long ago, which was a white reader talking in really appreciative ways about the autobiography. And in some ways, in a very sensitive, very nuanced way, it was, I thought, very perceptive, but in some ways also kind of blind, right? Suggesting that what the result of the late turn toward Orthodox Islam in the volume entails is an openness for white readers to, take on some moral responsibility and somehow, exit the legacy of American racism and somehow, have an independent moral compass. And just like that introduction, I'm like, no, that is not what he's saying. That is totally not what he's saying. A beautiful example of this happens. Let me just find the passage. There's a lovely passage fairly late in the book that kind of brings this out. He says, "The next day I was in my car driving along the freeway when at a red light another car pulled alongside. A white woman was driving, and on the passenger side next to me was a white man. 'Malcolm X,' he called out. And when I looked, he stuck his hand out of the car across at me grinning. 'Do you mind shaking hands with a white man?' Imagine that. Just as the traffic light turned green, I told him, 'I don't mind shaking hands with human beings. Are you one?'" And of course, you can, if you want to read that passage in a particular way, see it as like, oh, look, Malcolm is ready to shake hands with this white man. No, I don't think so. Like, he's asking, are you one? I don't think he shakes hands with this guy, And so it's this moment where that desire to, this white person's desire to kind of exit the economy of structural racism is like, no, you can't do that. There's another much more subtle way in which white readers come to the autobiography. And I have to confess to being drawn in by this too, right? And I'm not quite sure what to make of it. It's kind of interesting to think about this, the prison narrative where he talks about being so hungry for books and learning. And he talks about wanting to learn and pulling out a dictionary. And he says, "I spent 2 days just riffling uncertainly through the dictionary's pages. I'd never realized so many words existed. I didn't know which words I needed to learn. Finally, just to start some kind of action, I began copying." And he talks about reading historical stuff. He talks about being absolutely appalled in learning more about the history of slavery. He talks about seeking out all the things he could about, Black history and so on, right? And that one piece I mentioned a little bit earlier, which is this white reader talking about Malcolm X, he talks about being really moved by that part of the narrative. And then there's another passage that happens right near the end of the book. And I'm sure, this is something that Malcolm X says, but Alex Haley is clearly positioning it in a way that has a lot of force for the reader. So it's both part of things that Malcolm X is saying, but it's also, there's a kind of a literary craftsmanship to it too, is this passage where Malcolm is talking about education. He says, "My greatest lack has been that I don't have the kind of academic education I wish I had been able to get. To have been a lawyer, perhaps. I believe I might have made a good lawyer. I've always loved verbal battle and challenge." And he goes on saying that he really wishes he would learn more languages. It's frustrating to be around people talking something you can't understand. He talks about feeling ignorant hearing people talk African languages when he was during his travels. And he says, "Aside from the basic African dialects, I would try to learn Chinese because it looks as if Chinese will be the most powerful political language of the future. And I've begun studying Arabic, which I think is going to be the most important spiritual language of the future. I would just like to study. I mean ranging study because I have a wide open mind. I'm interested in almost any subject you can mention." So this is clearly like in keeping with the personality we know he has. We know he's a quick study. That's how he masters any environment he finds himself in, whether it's the dance hall, whether it's, selling drugs, like whatever, right? He masters the environment he finds himself in. But it's also there as a kind of trail of breadcrumbs for you, reader, to be like, oh yeah, I feel like that too, right? If you're a reader, you're presumably somebody who likes to read, right? And so I find myself kind of caught on the fence here, right? Because on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, I really can get on board with that. On the other hand, I'm aware that that is really low-hanging fruit, right? That is a way to draw you in, right? So I feel like it's an odd aspect of the text. And like I said, it's not surprising that that's one that readers find unthreatening.
It's interesting. I need to think about all of this more. But while those were very compelling parts of the text for me, And while I also, sympathized with Malcolm in the desire to lead a life where you can just study the world and learn all the languages and not have to be bogged down through fighting injustice. Like, that would be great if that weren't a problem. There were plenty of other parts of the book that I found as compelling, right?
Yeah.
And yet it seemed like in this article, maybe that these specifically literary and knowledge-based systems that often white readers do get caught up in those and use those as entry points. It's interesting to think about the readers who see an intellectual turn happening in the prison conversion and in the turn to literacy. Whereas you were saying, he's clearly an incredibly intelligent person, an incredibly intelligent young person earlier on. The book presents him as successfully navigating every situation he's thrown into from childhood on, and in noticing details that allow him to do this and will allow him much later to be able to tell us about this world in fantastic detail. I can't talk about what the world was like when I was 14 the way that Malcolm was able to. So he's clearly got this wide-ranging intellect. And what has changed in part through the literacy is just, again, this sort of opening of possibility space. He was really good at being a hustler, but there was only so many ways that could turn out for him, as he describes. Like, this is not going to have a happy ending, even in the best case scenario. It was this access to getting a way out, getting other possibilities that might be a little bit more promising. That is what changes in that. And it's not, literacy opens that up, but there are a number of other things that do as well.
Yeah. And I think maybe that sense of almost boundless capacity of openness to experience, of mastering your environment is again, one of the things that creates this incredible sense of poignancy. Like, one of the things I was thinking about as I was reading this is things like reparations, in the wake of American slavery. I find myself, wondering, well, what can we infer about what kinds of positions he would have taken about issues like that? Like contemporary issues, like right now, right? I think it's that radical openness, which is very different from the radical openness we saw in Whitman. It's like totally different from that radical openness, but that ability to take stock of a situation and chart out a course of action, which might get modified, which inevitably would get modified over time, but to be bold in moving forward with it, I can't help longing for that voice. It's hard not to.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to have been able to see where his thoughts would have developed.
Yeah.
And what would have happened to our world.
Well, that's the thing. I hate to think about counterfactuals, right? But this is somebody who's clearly transforming the world around him, right? Yeah. And that's a dangerous person, right?
Yeah. And even people who were not entirely on board with him. As we're not, as most people weren't, as he admitted that most people weren't, nevertheless found him to be astonishingly compelling and forthright.
Yeah, though I think they felt able to say that once he was dead.
It was much easier,
right?
I'm sure.
No, absolutely, right? And so, again, like you're reading this book, he talks about making distinctions between what he calls house Negroes and field Negroes, right? This is the language he uses, right? And he's talking about people who play the game and get ahead as individuals, as opposed to people who are either forced into or choose to take hard positions. And like, that hasn't changed, right? That is not an environment that we've left behind us. It's a book that's an intensely literary book. It's a wonderful read. It's engaging. It's exciting. It's moving, right? It gives you a lot of emotions, but it's also of the moment. Like, I felt like in some ways I was really aware this was 1965. And in other ways I was like, wow, this is right now.
Yeah. It's a really well-written book, in part because it's tying together Haley's skills in terms of crafting a narrative, both in journalistic and novelistic ways. Those early chapters of crime just read like a potboiler novel.
And the music scene in Harlem.
Oh,
right?
that
so
passage was so fascinating. And similarly, in the epilogue, the way that he crafts the sequence of events leading up to the assassination, because I didn't know exactly when it was going to happen. I didn't have a date stuck in my head. And he starts about 2 months before, maybe even a little earlier. But he has several events that you're like, is this the one where he gets assassinated? No. Okay, he's fine. And then the tension just ratchets up as he just goes over this almost newspaper, like, here's what happened this next day, and here's this, and it just builds until finally you see the event coming. You're like, oh, this is clearly the one, because all lines are pointing to it. It's long, and it's an astonishingly well-paced ratcheting up of the tension until you get to the assassination, and then the release of what happens afterwards, and how people respond and how the funeral unfolds. Masterfully done. You also get all these moments where Malcolm's oratorial skill comes in, especially in chapter 15, which is called Icarus, which is a massive chapter. And it feels more like what Malcolm's original conception of the book would have been. A bunch of lectures, a bunch of political points, a bunch of drumming up of history and argumentation and force. And it's just great. Like, it's just amazing to see his intelligence and intellect and oratorial skill and phrasing on display. And as you say, like, this is a text that feels very much like it's being pulled out of a certain moment in the 60s. And it also feels very relevant to today, but also it feels relevant today in a way that you still have to understand that it's coming from a different moment, even if it still applies. This is not the way we would talk about this today, but nevertheless, the sheer force of it is still strong.
Yeah, and it's intersecting with contemporary conversations in all kinds of ways. We alluded earlier to like problematic aspects of the book, and that shows up in its treatment of women, which is at times extremely misogynistic, right? In ways that, like, on the one hand, like, I understand it's like the 60s and I understand the Nation of Islam has a particular set of commitments, but I'm also like, ooh.
Yeah.
And then also passages that you can definitely read in the context of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And yet also a kind of sensitivity to issues that were on the ground in the mid-60s that have reemerged and or continued to be active in all kinds of ways, like around Palestine and things like that. So he talks in a very logical and clear-headed way about the necessity of the state of Israel, like why it has to be there and the ways in which it emerges as a response to the Holocaust. Like, he totally gets that. He says, in establishing their own country, he says, it's the one thing that every race of man in the world respects and understands. So he's clear about that. But he also refers to the British acquiescing and helping them to wrest Palestine away from the Arabs, the rightful owners. So he's got this strong sense of both might makes right and also that injustice takes place. Like, both of these things are true. And, again, that's something that's going on in 1965, but it's also like part of the contemporary world and intersects with Black American experience in certain kinds of ways. So, like, in the one hand is a book that's of the past, but it's also a book that's of the moment.
So this is a conversion text, or it's a text of many conversions, but it's largely centered around a particularly profound conversion that is in the middle of the book.
Two big ones, I think. Two big turns, two big conversions. There's the one that happens in prison. When we're reading the book, we think that's the turn, but of course then the other one happens when he goes on Hajj.
Yes.
Right? So that's part of what gives the book a sense of dynamism, I think, that goes, because it's not just like it's one narrative with one turning point. There's two big turning points that look like falls. They look like catastrophes, but they're not just that.
And it's also interesting because when you read conversion literature, there often isn't a second conversion.
No, there's never a second conversion. Well, that's the whole point, right? That's what's so radical about it. And, I've read this book a number of times. And so reading it for today, one of the things that struck me is this really, really interesting thing that happens. He explicitly makes the comparison with Paul on the road to Damascus in prison. You remember? He says, in talking about his experience in prison, he says, many a time I've looked back trying to assess just for myself my first reactions to all this. I remember how, reading the Bible in the Norfolk Prison Colony Library, I came upon, that I read over and over, how Paul on the road to Damascus, upon hearing the voice of Christ, was so smitten that he was knocked off his horse in a daze. I do not now, and I did not then, liken myself to Paul, but I do understand his experience. And then later he says it was like a blinding light. So we're really set up to be like, oh yeah, this is the conversion experience. That we should have been tipped off by the fact that he was using a Christian conversion experience there to know there was going to be something else coming. In other words, like, if you think about it as a kind of a supersessionist kind of thing, like, that looked like the conversion moment, right? But in fact, this other thing happens when he's expelled from the Nation of Islam. He goes on Hajj, and he's going to have another kind of experience that's going to be also revelatory, but he's not going to use this New Testament Christian frame of reference to talk about it. In other words, he's going to use a Christian frame of reference to talk about becoming part of the Nation of Islam. And that's really interesting.
That is interesting.
Right?
And I wonder, like, we'd have to look through the archives to look at the manuscript and the editing history, because the bulk of that section would have been written before the Hajj.
Yeah.
But he was still changing things. He was still trying to, making small changes and proposing large changes.
That would be so neat to know.
So yeah, I have no idea.
Because there are manuscripts, right, where we can see the work that Alex Haley's been doing, but also the markups that Malcolm has been doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And I don't know enough about Is Paul treated as at all in Islamic traditions?
No, not at all. I mean, there's
that
all
makes
kinds of
sense.
stuff that's in the Christian Bible, but like that whole apostolic, Paul, like, forming the Christian church in certain kind of ways, that's totally not happening in there. So that's kind of interesting, right? And, the Paul reference is one of the moments where you get a really strong sense of the kind of Augustine's Confessions kind of intertext, which has got to be in the background there somewhere, whether it's a text that Malcolm knows, whether it's a text that Alex Haley knows, it's in the background there somewhere. Somebody knows that literary baggage. But this is a text that's going to defy that expectation by having that second turn, that other thing.
Part of me is a little bit sad that we haven't done the Confessions yet to be able to speak about these things. But part of me is also excited to eventually read the Confessions with this text in the background to think about how this, in other words, changing up the order of what is influencing what in terms of how we talk about it.
Yeah.
I mean, the central conversion in Augustine's Confessions, of course, is another example of picking up a book. Tole lege, pick up the book and read it.
Yeah.
And that leads to his commitment to Christianity.
Yeah.
And in this case, reading takes on a very different and much, in many ways, richer sense of how it can transform Malcolm. But
yeah, I think it's got to be Alex Haley who knows that narrative, because those sections, like where we're in Boston and then we're in Harlem, and then there's that like abject period of like, drug abuse, and then, we're doing burglary and stuff like that. That is so Augustine and Carthage. Right? So somebody is thinking about that book and using it to set us up for a certain kind of expectation, but then it's going to get pulled out from under us.
And I also love that one of the first books he picks up and reads in that Augustinian sense is the dictionary.
Yeah.
And he describes, he says, funny thing from the dictionary, first page right now, that aardvark springs to my mind. The dictionary had a picture of it, a long-tailed, long-eared, burrowing African mammal, which lives off termites. And so we got this idea that, it's a sort of oversized African mammal that in a weird way almost rhymes with him and almost points to some things in his future, that he's still using it for this purpose of picking up the book and looking at it in order to learn things about the world in this fortune telling through picking up a book and opening it to a random page method.
Yeah, well, looking for knowledge wherever you can find it, right? There's this sort of Islamic tradition, a hadith saying, search for knowledge even as far as China, right? And so, this is the kind of ethos that we see there, right? You look and you find whatever you can find.
He also has some just really weird and fun theories about some of the books that he reads while he's in prison, which I think we might as well go over.
Yeah.
He talks about Socrates. He says, my impression was that most Occidental philosophy had largely been borrowed from Oriental thinkers. Socrates, for instance, traveled in Egypt. Some sources even say that Socrates was initiated into some of the Egyptian mysteries, which is an interesting tradition to draw upon. And that initiating into mysteries, of course, rhymes really nicely with the description of Diotima's mysteries that he's initiated into in the Symposium.
Yeah, and it's in keeping actually with turns that would happen in the field of classics, like, later on, right, in the late 70s and early 80s, where Black Athena and things like that, where that old kind of whitewashed vision of classical heritage where the Greeks and Romans seamlessly lead into, Western civilization, it's actually a more complicated Mediterranean history, right? So he's kind of got his, he's gesturing toward that kind of history as well.
He also brings up similar ideas with Homer, where he theorizes that Homer was black, that you can tell this in his name because Homer and Omar
he loves
and
etymology.
are etymologically related, which I'm not sure that's quite true.
Yeah, his love for etymology is sometimes like more poetic than real practical, but he's giving counter narratives, right? Like he's pushing back against what he calls explicitly this is sort of whitening of history. He's not wrong about that.
Yeah. And they are still delightful ideas to play with. However, the details may or may not be accurate. They're still enchanting.
Yeah, he has such an interesting mind. There was this, again, I was reading this. I've read the books a number of times, right? So, but reading it this time, again, things were new to me. And then one of the passages that was really new to me was this interesting one where he talks about the rug, the use of the rug.
Yeah.
Did you notice that passage? I thought that was so cool.
I mean, I loved a lot about that section, but the rug in particular was fantastic.
He says this. He says, during his experiences on Hajj, he says, I began to see what an important role the rug played in the overall cultural life of the Muslims. Each individual had a small prayer rug, and each man and wife or large group had a larger communal rug. These Muslims prayed on their rugs there in the compartment. Then they spread a tablecloth over the rug and ate, so the rug became a dining room. Removing the dishes and cloth, they sat on the rug, a living room. Then they curl up and sleep on the rug, a bedroom. Later in Mecca, I would see yet another use of the rug. When any kind of dispute arose, someone who was respected highly would sit on a rug with the disputers around him, which made the rug a courtroom. In other instances, it was a classroom. And it's such an interesting passage. Like you get such a sense of quality of mind, like a mind that looks at this and makes inferences and understands different potential spaces. I mean, what kind of mind is that?
It's one that's well worth spending time with while you're reading this book, for sure.
Totally.
So last time we talked about Whitman's capacious view of America. Are there any other specific ways that we want to underline about Malcolm's take on America?
Well, one of the things we were talking about when we were reading Whitman is how he's got this kind of imperative to heal the wounds of the Civil War, and he's prepared to paper over whatever he needs to do in order to achieve that. And so we talked about the ways in which that inflects Whitman's presentation of African Americans and Native Americans, how he's not going to really acknowledge not just the brutal history that lies behind that depopulation, that colonization, and the history of slavery, but he's also not going to make a peep about what's going on in terms of Reconstruction and so on, right? Here, we've got a willingness to reckon with that history and to think about its ongoing impact. Like this is not a bad past that's safely put away in the historical past. It's something that's going on. It doesn't let you forget it for a minute. And he talks about America in all kinds of ways. And we were talking a little bit before about reparations, and I was wondering, what would he say about reparations? What would he think about reparations? He says this. He says, every white man in America, when he looks into a black man's eyes, should fall on his knees and say, I'm sorry. My kind has committed history's greatest crime against your kind. Will you give me the chance to atone? But do you, brothers and sisters, expect any white man to do that? No, you know better. And why won't he do it? Because he can't do it. And this, will you give me a chance to atone? He doesn't expect it to happen, but that seems to me really to gesture toward that conversation. And it's about the history of America and what do you do with that? And to what extent can people to live together and to what extent can't they? By the end, he's kind of seeming to make room for a different kind of possibility. His experiences in Mecca lets him say that it doesn't have to be the way it is in America. It could be different. That while some readers, I think, want to understand that as meaning we could choose not to be racist, what he's saying explicitly is that within Islam, there are other ways of being. If you have the grace of conversion or something, maybe there's another way of being. He's not saying white people, you can choose not to be racist. So he's saying things about America that are about what was happening in 1965 and the years before. But I think it's something you should also be thinking about right now. What I wonder is there a potentiality there? I mean, I think Alex Haley, he's writing for, if not a largely white audience, at least partially a white audience, right? He's definitely doing that. So he has a real interest in making it easy for you, white reader, to imagine there's a door open for things to be better, for a more positive vision of America. I don't know how much that's, I don't know what to think about that optimism.
Yeah, I don't know whether Malcolm would have, even at the end of his life, agreed with that.
I don't know. He was clearly interested in Pan-African nationalism. So international movements that establish solidarity in different kinds of ways.
Yeah, and he had spent a lot of his pre-Hajj life as a separatist, and he was arguing for things like there should be a black state.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't complete separation from America, but it was a radical reinterpretation of how America is structured, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know at the end of the day whether he thought America was salvageable.
I don't know. And but the one thing we do come away with is this is somebody who was ready to change his mind depending on what he thought was going on, right? So we'll never know the answer.
I would be very curious to see what he would have thought of the 50 years that have passed since then and what stock he would take of us now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what his answer would be.
It's sad. Happily, our next book is my favorite book. This one is awesome, but the next book is my favorite book.
Yes, we'll be doing Moby Dick next, finally.
Which is lots of people's favorite book. I'm interested to observe.
I mean, I think it is in some ways a book that you either love or hate.
That's right.
And I have not yet read the entire book. When I was sat down to read Moby Dick a few years ago, I got about a quarter of the way through it, and I loved it all the way, but it's a lot.
Yeah, and I think it's very much a book that is okay to enjoy on the way. It's a book you can read the whole thing. That's great, but it is absolutely not necessary. It's enjoyable in fragments.
Yeah, I get the sense that even not having read everything, I could pick it up and reread sections or skip ahead and take plenty of pleasure in wherever I found myself. So I'm looking forward to going back to it. I'm looking forward to hopefully finally finishing it. It's a big book. It's a long book.
It's a wonderful book.
It's a wonderful book. It is totally great. And it'll be interesting to see how his thoughts on America line up with, because America isn't the central topic of his book.
A lot of it's implicit. I mean, I think you can say all kinds of interesting things about America, not because he's talking explicitly about it, but he's showing you and not telling you.
Exactly. So it'll be interesting to see how that echoes off these two much more explicit takes on what America is, good or bad. Yeah, it'll be really interesting.
And also, it gave us the name of the podcast.
And also, yes, those of you who wondered what exactly the Spouter-Inn is, well, all will be revealed next time. But in the meantime, if any listeners want to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/11, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
we'll see you at the Spouter-Inn.